Hello everyone, and welcome to a video where I will be covering one of my favorite defenses for the black pieces against one e4 opening. I recommend the French defense for a long time to my students. Now, most of the times your opponent at this point are just going to be covering the center right away with one d4, but it's also possible to see a move like knight f3, and 90% of the time this is just going to be transposition into one of the lines we're going to observe. So once white takes over the middle, we're going to be playing d5, and here white has a couple of choices. We're going to be analyzing the exchange variation, the advance variation, and a variation where they simply defend this pawn on e4 with knight d2 or knight c3. Well, first of all, let's see what happens if they play e5. White is obtaining a clear space advantage on the left side of the board. What this provides them is with possibility to attack your king later with ease if the situation doesn't change. You can see that on the left side of the board, they'll be able to put more pieces looking at your king, and in general just more pieces on the left side than you can. Your knight is restrained, you cannot go to f6 square, for example, and it feels like you don't have a lot of room to develop the left side pieces right now. But we're going to play the move c5, which is going to be creating a positional threat of removing the pawn on d4 to make the e5 pawn vulnerable. So even though they will have space advantage after something like knight f3, for example, and we take, doesn't matter how they take, we can apply a lot of pressure on this pawn later on, and now the weakness on e5 is fully compensating black for lack of space advantage. The best move for white is simply to play the move c3 and now guard the pawn on d4. There's a substitute pawn, and at this point particularly, it makes no sense for black to be capturing on d4. At lower levels, you could often see a move like bishop to b5. This in general is the best minor piece in the advanced French on the board. You can just see once I put, for instance, it on d3, that's not the right move, but I just want you to observe the activity that the bishop is generating. It's absolutely marvelous. So if at any point they're going to be playing a move like bishop b5 and you get a chance to swap it for your bishop or knight, you're always very happy with the outcome after something like bishop d7 or knight to c6. Most of the time c3 is going to be played, and here we're going to be playing knight to c6 followed by knight to f3 by white. And in this position we can make an awkward move which doesn't look devious or cunning, but it's going to be causing a lot of practical problems for white. If they don't know the right move, I give almost zero chance that they're going to be playing the best move here for the white pieces. So the problem for white is that it's very hard to develop without running into all sorts of traps. For example, if they play bishop to e3 to develop, the b2 pawn drops. If they're ever going to be playing knight to d2, then the d4 pawn is dropping. If they play a move like bishop to d3, which is probably the most natural move in the position, we could take on d4 to define the weakness, and then because knight takes, queen takes, there is bishop b5 check, and white would be winning the queen. We don't want that. So after we take once and define the weakness, we simply are going to play the move bishop to d7. After this move, we're threatening to take on d4, and there is no convenient way for white to defend the pawn except to move the bishop back. So if they try something like bishop c2 so that queen would be guarding that, that doesn't look good. We have knight b4 followed possibly by moves like bishop b5 preventing castling, and white has a lot of problems. It's possible to play the move bishop to d3 as a gambit for the white pieces. After we take on d4, white could simply not take back but castle instead. And they're waiting for black to capture on c3 while knight would be taking back. In this position, I simply recommend developing the queen side with moves like, for example, bishop to d7, then the knight could be going to e7, and we have interesting positions where black is pretty much waiting for white to develop the knight and take on c3 so that white would be forced to take back with the pawn. And other than that, both players are somewhat paralyzed. White is waiting to develop the knight, but doesn't want to, while black's dark square bishop is struggling. Black has some moves to make, like rook c8, maybe knight a5, knight c4, then a knight to c6, and at some point, black hopes to castle and finish the development. So as we go back, one other very natural move for white would be the move bishop to e2. After this move, I recommend defining the weakness by taking on d4 and getting the pawn into f5. So if they play a typical move like castling, for example, which would be, I think, the most natural move to the beginner players, then knight f5 will win the pawn later on. And this is the way we can apply pressure on that pawn. So These are pretty much the points of queen b6. It makes white's development somewhat confusing. And white's best move here is a3, after which there are a couple of ways of playing for the black pieces, but I recommend simply castling queenside later on and playing the move c4 to close down the position. Now, if the pawn is on a2, c4 can almost never be played because white will simply play for the break b3, after which you'll pretty much be forced to take, as the pawn is hard to protect, and in general you don't want to move the deep 5 pawn towards c4 here. And after taking, they get an open file, you have lost the pawn in the center, they're gonna overwhelm you in the center. So after a3 instead, we can play c4 because for white it's very hard to carry out b3 under the right circumstances. They could try with knight bd2 and then playing b3, but black has a move knight a5. And in this position, black wants to castle queenside. Typical moves would include like bishop to d7. Well, we could make maybe those moves on the board, right? It's a free country. So castles, say for example, knight to e7. Very often white is trying to prepare rook b1 and b3, but is unable to carry out under the right circumstances. The c3 and a3 pawn often can get pretty weak if they do it at the wrong moment. Then black would castle long very often. The knight could be heading to b6, then knight a4 or bishop a4, castles queenside, bishop e7, and at some point we're hoping to develop counterplay along the gf and h files. That would be your long-term plan. Now, as we go back, the other variation that black needs to know is the exchange variation. And I tell my students always to remember that different variations in French have to be played differently. So don't play in the exchange variation the ideas that you have learned in the advanced variation. In this position, the e file is open, so black really wants to castle as soon as possible and put the rook on e8. So it's dangerous right now to copy the previous strategy where center was closed and we were developing the queen side first. And usually it leads to a pretty symmetrical play. For example, knights go out. I just want to give you sort of a setup. Queen e2 here is one move that could perplex you a little bit. We're just going to be playing bishop e6 in these cases. And after knight g5, even though they're winning the bishop pair, it's really not dangerous at all. For example, queen e7, say we take on e6, pawn takes and they castle. In this position, well, castling is not the most precise, but I just want to show you how black would get a good game after knight c6, then breaking with e5, long castle, short castles, and then the rooks go to f8 and e8. And I think black is getting fantastic play with superb central control and piece activity, which definitely compensates for the lack of two bishops. Instead, most often your opponents are just going to be castling, and I just want to show you the most typical mistake that you could see in this exchange variation is players playing knight to c3. After you're going to be playing the move bishop to g4 and say bishop g5 and c6. I just want to compare the setup with pawn on c6 and knight d7 versus the knight on c3 and pawn on c2. The difference is that they kind of break the pin and the queen is pretty much tied down to the knight. The only way to break the pin is moving back. Then they have wasted a tempo, maybe your bishop could be covering that diagonal. So very often they're going to be playing this inaccurate move, knight to c3 in the setup, whereas you could be free. You could play queen to c7, rook to e8. Also, one typical idea is to be moving the bishop around to exchange your bad bishop, because your pawns in the center are the same color, for opponent's good bishop. So bishop h5, bishop g6 can be played, and very often what we don't want to do is we don't want to play h6, unless you can follow it up with like g5. Because now if you go with the bishop here, then the light square bishop can damage your pawn structure. So most often be very careful about playing h6. Rather, bishop h5, bishop g6 is more typical. And just one more variation that we need to cover. That is if white is guarding the pawn on e4. And we're going to be taking that pawn, and we're going to be playing knight to d7 with the idea of playing the other knight to f6. This is called the Rubinstein variation. We could analyze this for like 10 hours non-stop, but I want to give you an example game, which is typical way of playing this at club level player. So white is going to be taking on f6 and developing very normally. Black is hitting with c5. It equalizes in space. If they don't take, we'll take on d4. Unless they have played a move like bishop e3. It's very dangerous for the white's dark square bishop to get to d4, so just be aware of that. For example, dc5 takes, castles, castles, bishop g5, now we're gonna fianchetto, very calm development. Queen to e2 preparing rook d1 to look at our queen, bishop b7, rook a d1, and here is one idea that you wouldn't know if I didn't tell you, that in the Rubinstein variation, we're often not afraid of white doubling up our f-pawns as they do not have a follow-up kingside attack. So for example, if they take over here, you could simply play rook d8, f5, the dark square bishop could always come back home. We got 2 bishops for almost nothing. This position was played hundreds of times by masters, and it's been proven that white has no attack. Black absolutely safe with the 2 bishops. I recommend trying to exchange the rooks along the d file. This would alleviate the kingside attack opportunities even further. Pretty much if they don't want to exchange the rooks along the d file, then you control the only open file in the position. If you enjoyed today's video, consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.